Welcome everyone, this is Kerjims channel. Now we are back to our new episodes of 2 Semi-Reality Champions and Comparison, featured by Wild League of Legends versus the Mobile Legend Bang Bang. But before that, please like and subscribe to my channel and don't forget to click the bell right now so you will be notified to our new next episode video. Let's do this!
The story begins with the Targonian called Atreus, named after a star in the constellation of War, known as the Pantheon. Just like many other in his tribe, Atreus trained to join the Raharat, which was an order of elite warriors in the Rakor tribe. Atreus wasn't the strongest or even the most skilled warrior, but he had endurance and determination. And somehow he kept standing up, bloody and bruised after every battle. In time, he found a fierce rival, a fellow recruit called Phyllis. But no matter how many times Atreus fell on the stones, he always stood back up. This unrelenting will impressed Phyllis, and through the blood they spilled in the training circle, a true brotherhood was born between them. Sometime later, Atreus and Phyllis managed to survive a barbarian invasion, while the rest of their patrol died. They sought revenge, and so they turned towards the aspect of the sun to help them. But for some reason, the aspect refused to destroy these trespassers. And Atreus and Phyllis swore to capture the power of the aspect themselves by climbing the peak of Mount Sargon. Like so many before them, they underestimated how challenging this task would be. When they finally reached the peak, Phyllis froze to death, and only Atreus remained to see the skies open before him, making him host to a divine aspect with the power to take his revenge. However, this wasn't a normal ascension. Atreus now wielded a spear and a shield gleaming with celestial might. But it wasn't Atreus who returned back to Rakor. It was the aspect of war itself, the Pantheon. Judging Atreus unworthy, since he was a warrior who kept getting defeated in every battle, the aspect of war didn't lend Atreus its power. Instead, it took Atreus' body into its own control, in order to pursue tasks too great for mortal man. Atreus was still technically alive, but he was cast into the furthest corners of his own mind. As the aspect used his body, Atreus only saw visions, as the aspect traveled the world hunting down the Darkin. Eventually, Pantheon was locked in battle not far from Mount Sargon. His opponent was the Darkin Aatrox, who wanted to claim the mountain's peak for himself. Their fight raged into the skies and swept through the armies of men beneath, until the impossible happened. Aatrox's god-killing blade was driven into Pantheon's chest. The blow was so powerful it destroyed the aspect itself, and the constellation of war disappeared from the heavens. But as the aspect faded, Atreus, the man it had considered weak, awoke once more. Impaled on Aatrox's blade, and with the power of the aspect's weapons dimming, Atreus took a breath and spit in Aatrox's face. Aatrox just sneered and left Atreus to die. But hours later, as the crows descended, Atreus did the one thing that defined him. He was bloodied and bruised, but once again, he painfully stood back up. After a lifetime of defeat, with his will to live and full of anger at being betrayed by the aspect, he wouldn't allow death to claim him like it did war itself. So with the trail of blood behind him, he stumbled back to Rakor. Back in Rakor, Atreus recovered in Phyllis' home, healed by Ayula, Phyllis' wife who was now a widow. It was there that Atreus realized he had spent his entire life looking up to the stars, but he never considered what's beneath. Unlike gods, mortals fight because they must. They know that death is certain for them. In fact, barbarian invaders now threaten the Rakor's northern settlements, including Ayula's farm. So a couple of months later, when he finally recovered, Atreus picked up his dull spear, and he set out to end the scourge himself. But when he arrived, he found his sworn enemies already under siege. He knew from their cries and from the overwhelming stench of blood that they faced Aatrox, and everything suddenly made sense. The reason why the barbarians attacked Sargon, and why the aspect of the sun refused to destroy them, was because they were driven here by Aatrox. And even though Atreus still saw them as his enemies, they were much like the Rakor, mortals who suffered in the conflicts between greater powers. Atreus now felt cold rage at both the Darkin and the Aspects. They were no different. They were the problem. Atreus put himself between the barbarians and Aatrox. Recognizing the better shield and spear of the fallen Aspect, Aatrox mocked him. Without the Pantheon's power, Atreus was no one. But even though Aatrox's blows cast him to his knees, upon hearing the cries of the people around him, Atreus' own will reignited the Aspect's fear, and with a mighty leap, he struck a blow that severed the Darkin's sword arm. Both the blade and the Darkin fell to the ground. Only Atreus still stood, and watched his namesake star blaze back into life in the heavens. Though he often yearned to return to Iola's farm, Atreus vowed that day to stand against Aspects, Ascended, demons, and any who wield power so great it can only destroy. Forsaking his own name, he became a new Pantheon. The Aspect's weapons fueled by the will to fight that can only exist in the face of death. For with the divine Pantheon gone, war must be reborn in men. This was Pantheon's new bio. But before we have a look at the short story that follows, let me quickly mention a couple of things to remember. First of all, the old Pantheon stories that involved Aurelian are still canon. The Twin Dawns, the story where a female Pantheon controlled Aurelian's soul, is still real. Pantheon, as in the aspect of war, chose its vessels just like the other aspects did. So when one of Pantheon's vessels died, it simply chose a new one. That part is still true. But as we mentioned, this time the Ascension was different, because instead of turning Atreus into Pantheon's vessel, it didn't trust Atreus. And so Pantheon decided to expose itself and transfer itself into the body instead. So all the past stories with different Pantheons are still real. Only now, in the modern days, the aspect of war died, and so we can't expect any new Pantheons to follow. This brings up the question, what is happening to Aurelian's soul now? Pantheon was the aspect that held him on a leash, but unless the other aspects can also hold him at bay. For example, we know that Zoe likes to toy with him too. That leash was now broken, and so Aurelian's soul might be free now. Also, a fun fact confirmed by Riot. Atreus is currently wielding the Aegis of Leona, a shield used by the previous vessel of the aspect of war. Lastly, I need to confess, I quickly read this story when I was still on our honeymoon, and I decided to tweet about it right after. However, I made an absolute fool of myself, because I thought that the story mentions that Aatrox's blade used to be part of his arm. You know, just like Demon Blade Trindamir. But I didn't know that in order for that to be true, it would have to be spelled sword arm with a dash. If it is spelled without the dash, it means that it was his arm that was used for wielding the sword. Anyway, I wish that Aatrox used to have a sword instead of his arm. That would have made him even cooler. And it would perfectly fit the theme of the Darkin using blood magic to morph their bodies. Hashtag sword arm. Anyway, let's now have a look at the short story. Pantheon currently has two short stories. The first one is just an updated version of the old short story. It didn't change at all, apart from the fact that when the story talks about Pantheon, it is now correctly describing his updated appearance. In short, it's a story where Pantheon, as in the aspect of war when it was still alive, takes on a group of mercenaries heading towards Targon. But we are interested in the second short story. That one was newly released on the universe last week. So, let's get on it. This story happens after the death of the aspect of war, and after Atreus decided to be the new Pantheon that fights for mankind. The story begins with Pantheon falling from the sky, burning with celestial magic. He landed in Erypathos, a very special place to all lore fanatics, because it is here where the first prototype of the Sun Disk was built, and it was here where the Shurimans tried to create the first Ascendant. 50 warriors of the Rahurak army, specifically the revered Solaris, marched for 3 weeks to get here. Just like Pantheon, they were here to investigate a power that grew while their own way. As Pantheon explained, Shurima was born in these ruins, because it was here that the Ascended that were meant to protect the Empire were created. However, these Ascended God Warriors outlived the Empire, and slowly they were driven mad by long centuries of conflict, becoming darkened and laying waste to the world before being contained. But as Pantheon knows, not all Darkin were contained, and some still live on. With that, a couple of spears flew by Pantheon's house, as the Rahurak unleashed their full might with the battle cry. But in response, a blast of magic cleared the spears from the sky, and carved a path of destruction through the roots. Once the dust settled, Pantheon saw it. The reason why he was here. A broken creature unlike any ascendant he had seen before. A shattered god that has claimed this fallen city and would see it rise again. The Rahurak realized they were facing a god warrior, and suddenly their morale quickly dropped. They couldn't defeat it, but Pantheon stepped forward. He was determined to show them how a god dies. With that, he charged towards the creature, and his spear was ablaze with celestial magic once more. He threw the spear at the enemy, and it unleashed another blast from its broken form. But unlike the Rahurak spears, Pantheon's weapon wasn't burned away in the air. Instead, it streaked like a comet at the ascending, casting it to the earth. Pantheon looked around, and he saw a Rahurak warrior cradling the body of her fallen friend. Her own arm had been scorched by magic, where she tried to shield her friend from the attack. She looked at Pantheon, and out of desperation, she asked him if he was an aspect. She wanted to know if Pantheon can save her and her friend. All around Pantheon, the Rahurak lines were broken, along with their will to fight. Pantheon didn't answer that question, as the spear flew back into his hand. The Ascended left no blood on the spear, because its form had no flesh. It was only magic and stone. Pantheon wanted to tell her his real name, that he too was once a Rahurak warrior, but that man was dead now. He died on Targon's peak, along with his brother Pylus, slain by the Pantheon by his own failure. Instead, Pantheon turned towards the creature again. He shouted at the Rahurak that they must fight, that all of them must. The city around them was now on fire, as the Ascended's magic refused to fade. Pantheon started running towards the Ascended, as even more blasts of magic flew around. The ruins of the city crumbled down, and the Rahurak disappeared in dust. With every step, Pantheon kept yelling louder and louder that they simply must fight. When he finally got in range, he started slashing into the Ascended, cutting across the broken stone that bowed instead of a face. More blasts crashed into his shield, pushing him backward, and eventually Pantheon's feet dig into the dirt as he struggled to hold the rage-filled magic that kept beating into it. Pantheon leaned into it, and the magic started deflecting wildly in every direction, cutting through the ruins, the sky, and through the Rahurak that still cowered beneath both. Pantheon was reaching his limits, and from the look in its eyes he realized the creature knew it as well. Suddenly, Pantheon's spear dimmed, and his helmet fell from his head. Spitting blood into the dirt, Pantheon saw that one Rahurak warrior framed by smoke in all the chaos. She looked back at him, and for the first time, she didn't see an aspect. She saw a man. A simple man just like all of them. Pantheon wondered if she knew who he really was, because her eyes were no longer full of pleading to the gods. They were full of determination. Pantheon noticed the light grow on her face as the creature gathered power for one more blast. But without hesitation, even though her arm was burned and her friend lay still, the warrior picked up her shield as she stumbled towards Pantheon to face death.